Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be doing a BIOS walkthrough for the EVGA Z390 Dark. And I'm not going to go over everything, like for example that, because I don't believe in whatever that does. I also don't really believe in whatever that does either. Actually, I do know what that does. It's not very good. We're going to get to that. And then that's just default settings. Anyway, so let's go into the actual BIOS, like into the settings options. And before we go through the OC tab, we're going to go through the extras tab. So home just brings you back to here. Not that you'd, like, I don't know why you'd ever really want to go there. We have a stress test functionality. Unfortunately, this stress test is not very good because it's even lighter than Cinebench, okay? Like, Cinebench at 5 gigahertz, 1.25 volts pulls like 14 amps. This right here pulls like 11. This is not, like, it's not even remotely stressful enough to be considered a stress test as far as I'm concerned. And that's basically the reason why the OC Robot functionality also doesn't work very well, because the OC Robot actually uses the built-in stress test utility of the BIOS to do the CPU overclock. And since the stress test is not very heavy, this thing is going to ramp up the voltage really, really high, as well as the frequency. And then once you get into Windows and you run like a real stress test, like Prime 95, even without AVX, it's going to thermal throttle like crazy. So it's not going to crash, but it's also not going to be stable because you'll be running at like 4.5 gigahertz instead of the 5.2 that it's going to end up going to. Like that's not viable. So I would not use that unless you have, like, maybe, well, no, I just wouldn't use that. Like, it's a nice idea, but the stress test is just not heavy enough. If the stress test was pulling more like 17 amps at 5 gigahertz, 1.25 volts, then sure, the OC Robot functionality might actually work. But as it is, this thing is lighter than Cinebench. And Cinebench is not, like, already Cinebench is not what I would consider a stress test. Like, there's a lot of overclocks that'll be Cinebench stable, and they'll crash at random just all over the place. So the stress test and the OC Robot functionality, great idea, awful execution, as is the case with most overclocking utilities. I mean, overclocking things. Next, we have the OC profiles and also the BIOS update. Now, I'm not actually going to go into those USB sticks because I have some BIOSes on there that I can't show you, but anyway, you basically just select the USB stick, you select the file, and press enter, and then it updates the BIOS. So, you know, we're not going to go through the process for that. But anyway, that's how you access that functionality. Then we have the OC profiles, yeah, we get a bunch of profiles here. So the 5.2 gigahertz Lumi Daily is very optimistic about how good your CPU is going to be. Like, let's just put it this way. Lumi's 9900K, which was probably the one used to configure this profile, is a chip that does like almost 7 gigahertz Cinebench on liquid nitrogen. It's like one of the best 9900Ks ever. He also killed it, but that chip was absolutely bloody insane. With all probability, unless you test like a few CPUs, you're not going to find one that does 5.2 gigahertz at 1.3 volts, even for like Cinebench. Well, okay, Cinebench might pass at 1.3, 5.2, but most chips won't do this. So, yeah. But other than that, the default profile is actually pretty decent. It sets up, like, this PCH overvolts is just unnecessary in my opinion, so we can just put 0 there. Also, fun fact about EVGA BIOS, you do not reset a value in this BIOS by on like an ASUS board. If you want to set it back to auto, you press A, and then it goes back to auto. On EVGA boards, you go to 0. So, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, it also sets up a memory overclock. That's also, in my opinion, kind of on the optimistic side in terms of you know, memory quality. It's not that, like, definitely there are memory kits out there that'll do this, but you might find that, you know, with your memory kit, you might have to drop a few hundred megahertz, maybe even as far as that. But this is actually pretty reasonable for most kits. Like, I'd expect most kits to hit this. Most decent Samsung BDI kits should hit this, but not necessarily everything. So anyway, now we're going to have to clear the BIOS. So discard restore defaults, and we're going to go back to the extras. Then we have an LN2 profile, which is a general profile. And yeah, it does tell you this sets up a bunch of extreme overclocking voltages, and you should only enable this profile when you're at like -120, -110, -130, because this profile essentially all of this red stuff you see right here is configured so that your cold boot bug and your cold bug on the CPU are eliminated. And the issue, so cold boot bug and cold bug is essentially what happens with CPUs is if they get too cold, certain parts of their circuitry just kind of stop working. And the problem with that is, well, you can't run anything if the CPU is literally frozen out. And the solution to that is to dump like ridiculous amounts of voltage into the various parts of this chip that essentially freeze up. This does make the chip run again, but first of all, these settings just straight up wouldn't work at ambient. And secondly, if you ran these at ambient, they'll break the CPU. So that's why not to set them up. But basically, this is a really good preset. Now, you might find that with certain CPUs, you might have to fine-tune from the voltages that Lumi has set up for his chip here, because not all chips will necessarily respond the same, but most chips should work with this profile right here. Like my 9900K works great with it. Lumi's gone through a bunch of chips, and I think he just keeps running this profile over and over again. I've heard that apparently other people have had great success with this profile as well. So, you know, it presets all of your voltages right off the bat for you, and that makes life very, very easy. Now, what you would want to play with, like, you might potentially want to lower the actual load line calibration. So, like less droop here, it's adding droop, because that right there is Intel load line spec. This is a 25% less steep slope. This is a 50% less steep slope. This is a 75% less steep slope, and this is a flat line. Also, it's worth noting with the load line settings is that this motherboard, I've not found a piece of software that gives you access to the voltage readout of the ISL 69138 that this board uses for its vCore VRM, which basically means you can't see the all of the voltage measurements that you can get on this motherboard are before the CPU socket. So they'll essentially read high, which is why if you like max out if you disable any V-droop, you're actually going to see voltage boost because the sensors are all before the CPU socket. This is in contrast to, say, Asus motherboards, where if you max out the load line calibration on an Asus motherboard, Asus has their voltage monitoring circuitry rewired so that everything monitors this voltage on the actual silicon of the CPU. Ultimately, it doesn't matter that much because you're going to want to run droop anyway, so you're either going to be running like 50% or 25%, depending on the CPU, or just what settings you're running and the benchmark. Like there's a lot of fine-tuning you can do here, because essentially you're trying to match the load line, you're trying to match it with the voltage regulator's ability to keep up with transient response. That's kind of the idea behind setting having actual V-droop. You can disable it, but the end result is that you'll just get a CPU that runs really, really hot and clocks as a result worse. So for example, I think my highest overclock was actually on -25%. Lumi's profile defaults to -50, but you can kind of use both. I kind of wish there was options for like -33%, so you could even more fine-tune it, but I'm going to go back to auto on that. All of these voltages, you know, you might have to go up and down on them depending on the CPU, but most of them, most chips should work with this as a preset. Then on the memory side, this is not all, none of my memory kits will run this, for example. So none of the memory I have will do this right here. So this is if you have a good kit of BDI, it should do this. If you have a really good kit of BDI, it might even do that. But if you have like kits like mine, then you might have to run something like, say, that, which is what I run for my kits. Potentially, you can also find that this can help with stability in a lot of cases, just going to 12. Really, really bad memory kits will end up around sort of like 3800, 3733, 36, 3600 even. But they might not need that much voltage. So I would say if you're like starting out on this motherboard, I would not just jump to 4133 right off the bat with this profile. Like, I know the profile defaults to that, but you should not just jump right there. I would honestly, unless you know your memory kit, and even if you do know it, like, you don't know if you don't know the motherboard, you don't know the CPU, how the CPU is going to behave right off the bat. You're probably going to want to lower the voltage a bit, lower the frequency. So, you know, I'd start at like something like that, and then actually I wouldn't need that there. So I'd start with something like that, and then I'd work it back up to the 4000. You don't actually have to change any of the subtimings at that point. The board takes it, everything that's on auto, the board configures for you better than you will configure it yourself, especially when it comes to the RTLs. So, yeah. You can leave all of this alone, but the profile does set up all your like your primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries about as tight as they go. You can potentially also do like that. That's really the only change I would make. On some kits, you might find that you have to run like RTP a bit looser and stuff like that, or also TCWL to like 11. Again, depends on the memory kit. Anyway, we're gonna go back to. And so also worth noting about this memory profile that this loads up. This is the reason why this profile is called general is because most benchmarks will prefer 4133, 12, 11, 11, 28 memory settings rather than the Geekbench profile. So what the Geekbench profile loads up is 4800 megahertz, slightly less voltage, 14, 13, 28, and basically similar subtimings, which is why this profile is kind of like, this is actually a really crazy set of settings, is that, like, yeah, your timings barely change from, you know, 4133 to 4800, but this profile is essentially like a super high memory bandwidth configuration. And because of how Geekbench 3's memory benchmark is written, this scores really, really well in Geekbench 3. There's a lot of other benchmarks where this doesn't actually work that well. In most benchmarks, you're going to be better off with 4133 CL12. Geekbench 3 is an anomaly where you're going to want to run 4800, 14, 13, 28. Now, the problem with this profile is you need more VCCSA. And in fact, a lot of CPU memory controllers, like my CPUs straight up don't do this. Like at 1.5 volts VCCSA, I can at best do like 15. So I can run like that. I can't run 1413. So depending on the CPU, this profile is again a little bit too aggressive. It might also be down to the memory kit. Yeah, if your kit can do this, then this basically takes care of all the difficult memory tuning work for you, and then you just have to fiddle with the CPU, like max out the CPU frequency, and that's it. So these profiles massively simplify the benching experience on liquid nitrogen. So yeah, they are useful. They're just a little bit, you know, they expect you to use good memory. I don't have any, well, not even good memory, like really good memory. I don't have any really good memory. Or my CPU's memory controller just can't take 4800 CL14, one of the two. Anyway, so we're going to go back to defaults. And then the last profile that you get is this Kingpin 10K Geekbench 3 boot profile. And this is not an LN2 profile. Why does that one throw up that warning? Yeah, it doesn't load up any of the bloody voltages to LN2 settings, so... Anyway, this one, however, absolutely, like, this one's basically a punch to the... Like, this is the same issue. It's a punch in the face for your memory controller. Oh boy, that TRFC. That's really low. These are kind of loose, though. So this could be a little bit easier to run than the Lumi 4800 megahertz profile. But that profile, also what it does is it actually disables a good chunk of your CPU. And the reason why is that profile is literally just meant for maxing out the Geekbench 3 memory sub-test, and it doesn't actually care about the overall score. So Geekbench 3 is a multi-core benchmark, but this profile right here is optimized to max out the memory score on Geekbench. That's literally all it's designed to do. I also can't run this one either. So Because again, it's just like you need absolutely insane CPUs to run settings like that. And yeah, your memory controller is going to love you after you do that to it. I'm actually not a fan of EVGA having 1.5 volts in yellow. That's, you know, because if you set it to like 1.6, it does eventually turn red. But I would be turning that red at like 1.4, if not 1.35 volts, because you really shouldn't be dailying 1.5 volts. Like, that is not good for your memory controller in the long term. You can ask my 7700K all about that. So, anyway, we're going to go back to defaults again. Restore defaults, yes. And now we can go through the settings here. So, first thing you get here is CPU multiplier control. You can go manual. You don't get any other option. Well, yeah, you don't really get any other options here. So you can set all of the cores to be at, you know, the same ratio by changing that right there. And if you're changing just a couple cores, so like you can set your one core, you know, frequency limit to like 5.1 or 5. And then if you do 5.2, this is like if you have a 2-core workload, then it'll boost both cores to 5.2 gigahertz and the rest. So, yeah, but if you're in an 8-core workload, then it'll drop back down. So this is not per core. This is, like, based on load. So it's basically like you can tweak the turbo boost settings. Quite frankly, it's most convenient to just run 50 across the board, because that way you don't have to stress test every single, you know, load configuration from 8 cores to 2 or 1 or whatever, however many different ratios you plan to run. Anyway, then we get ring ratio. So fun fact about the ring ratio, this doesn't have too much impact on your CPU performance overall, but it does quite drastically change your CPU core voltage requirement. So, you know, if you're trying to minimize your vCore, it is a good idea to try, you know, knock this down a bit. So normally you could run like, you know, 5 gigahertz CPU, 4.8 gigahertz ring ratio. And then if you're trying to minimize the voltage from there, you know, you could knock it down all the way to like 45 or even 44. It really doesn't have that much impact on your performance, but it does, you know, quite drastically change your CPU stability, especially if you have it right on top of your CPU ratio, because theoretically that right there, damn it, theoretically, running both at 5 gigahertz will give you optimal performance, but the stability, like, you're going to need way more voltage than you would otherwise. So that's kind of that. Which is also why normally on like a lot of other motherboards you would find ring to core down bin, which basically just forces the ring ratio to be below the core ratio so that you don't, you know, do this, because generally this is going to require ridiculous voltages. Anyway, so we're going to set our AVX, and then we have our AVX ratio. You know, you can set that to 0 if you want your CPU ratio to be the same everywhere. Yeah, like, in my opinion, you really, like, the thing is, AVX is like the greatest thing for CPU performance in the last couple years. So over time, things that use AVX acceleration are going to get steadily more and more common. And if you have like a 5.2 gigahertz CPU overclock that, you know, downclocks to 4.9, and most of the software you're running just downclocks the CPU to 4.9, maybe you should just run at 4.9 gigahertz all the time anyway, because most of the time you're not at 5.2 regard. Like, you know, like the difference between 5.2 gigahertz and 4.9 gigahertz in terms of performance, not that big. And if you're running a lot of stuff that hits the AVX ratio offset, then, I mean, you're literally not getting the benefit of that 5.2 gigahertz most of the time anyway. So who cares? So that's that's just my view on that. And so I normally just set that to 0. Because it also means that if you're doing any kind of, like, because I mostly use this board just for benchmarking, and in that scenario, it's just like, well, I don't have to wonder about why certain benchmarks suddenly underperform when it's like, oh yeah, that runs AVX. It's something that I forget about Cinebench R20 every so often. Anyway, next we have BCLK frequency. You can adjust it in increments of 1/10. It does, I do think on this board it's not quite as bad as the X299 Dark, where if you change the BCLK a bit, like the board goes through like basically it tries to boot up once and then boots up again, which is normal. I think this board kind of still does that, but it takes less time. So Anyway, that's just something like if the board boot loops after you change BC, okay, that's normal. If it boot loops once, it's not going to boot loop again every time after you've changed it, but the first time you change it, it'll boot loop once. And then every time you change it in the BIOS again. But if you change it in the operating system, then it's actually fine. So it's a bit of a mess. Then we have extreme voltage mode here, enable, disable. Oh, I guess that's what gives you the warning. Okay, well, that's really silly. Anyway, so the extreme voltage mode, what it does is like if we want to set like 2 volts right here, if we go back to disabled, it forces us back down to 1.6, and it imposes a similar voltage restriction on all of the other voltages. So it basically forces you into safe voltage limits, except I guess, yeah, that's not what I would consider a safe voltage limit right there, but whatever. So we're just, well, we can leave that disabled. If you're dailying, there's no reason to, you know, enable the extreme voltage limits. If you're benching, then, you know, you're probably going to want to enable them. But anyway, next we have vCore. You can use adaptive or you can use override. I would honestly say that to make your life easier, just run override, because if you're idling a 9900K at 5 gigahertz, 1.25 volts, you might start seeing a trend here with the testing I recently did. If you're idling at 5 gigahertz, 1.25 volts, the CPU still pulls only about like 2 amps down the CPU power connectors. So yeah, I mean, yeah, you could be idling on less than 24 watts, but it wouldn't really make that much of a difference. And your load power consumption will still be the same. Like, that's the thing to keep in mind. Like, as soon as the CPU comes out of idle and it's at full speed, it's going to be pulling the same power regardless of if you're adaptive or override. It's just that at idle, you'll be pulling slightly less power than with override, which is like who cares about 10 watts, if even 10 watts? So, because the thing is with adaptive, like, basically, this is it's harder to set the voltages up. So I would literally just run override all the time. Makes your life so much easier because you punch in 1.3 volts, then you just configure the V-Droop to match your your cooling capabilities and your CPU, and life's great. You don't need to worry about anything else. Whereas if you're messing with the adaptive voltage, like, you basically need to check the voltage under a bunch of different loads, and like, as far as I'm concerned, adaptive voltage is just a mess, and it doesn't really do that much for your power efficiency anyway. So, well, it does take, well, no, if you went by percentages, it makes a huge difference in your idle power efficiency. It's just that nobody cares, like, why would you care about 10 watts here or there? It's a desktop, not a laptop. If it was a laptop, yeah, 10 watts here or there translates into a much quicker, you know, battery drain, but on a desktop, it doesn't really matter at all. Anyway, next we have vCore Pwm Frequency. And right here it says values over 800 kilohertz negatively impact efficiency and thermals, which is true. Also, what's worth noting is that value maxes out at 1000, and if you set it to 1000, the board doesn't post. So that's bugged out. I'm not sure why they let you set 1000, because if you do set 1000, it doesn't work. Quite frankly, I've not really tested how much impact this has for overclocking range, but honestly, just going all the way up to 800 kilohertz, especially if you have the VR, like, if you still have the VRM heatsinks on the board, like you've not taken it apart like I have, because I use it for LN2 benching, and so I don't actually want the VRM heatsinks because they turn into just a massive condensation magnet, and the VRM doesn't really need them just for, like, short benchmarks. But if you're dailying the board, then you probably have the heatsinks still on there. Well, running it at 800 kilohertz is really not going to make much of a difference. Next, we have CPU vCore guard band. I just disable that most of the time. Actually, all of the time. Apparently, that's supposed to may cause CPU OC stability issues. I guess that might be if you're using adaptive, and if you're in override, it doesn't actually do anything. So I assume that probably achieves the same thing as like SVID disable on Asus boards. Anyway, Next we have VCCSA, so that's our system agent voltage. Raising this up and raising this improves your maximum memory frequency capability. VCCIO, similar story. It's another memory controller voltage. For daily, I would not exceed 1.35 volts on either of them. You will actually find that in most cases, just around 1.2 volts for most overclocks is perfectly stable. And yeah, you know, that's kind of that. On LN2, you need to run, I think on LN2, you actually need to run VCCIO high just to get past the cold boot bug and cold bug, but I'm not 100% certain on that. It might just be a KB-like, might just be a KB-like thing. But anyway, so for daily, you run them around like 1.2 to 1.35 volts. And they basically, you know, those will kind of dictate your memory overclock stability when you're really pushing high memory frequencies. So like, you know, 4,000 plus. Or if you're on dual rank, it'll actually also, you know, because if you're on dual rank, that actually puts more strain on the memory controller as well. So that scenario, both of those are helpful. Next, we get VCC Pll and VCC Pll boot. So this is for when the... Well, basically, the reason why there's a distinction between those is that you might find that for optimal overclocking, you need a different Pll voltage from the voltage you need, normally lower. That's the main concern. But if you're on LN2, you might need more VCC Pll boot just to get the system to start running. And once it's running, you can actually drop that voltage down a bit, and then it'll actually overclock better than if you have it set to the same voltage for both. But if you actually go over to like if you enable like the LN2 profile from Lumi, you'll notice that they're both set to the same thing. And these are both like these are cold bug removal voltages. So if you're on ambient, you just kind of ignore that these even exist. They don't do anything. Same for VCC Pll underscore OC and VCC Pll underscore OCV boot. Same distinction. One is only applied during the startup process of the motherboard. And the thing about VCC Pll OC is this voltage actually skews your temperature sensor, so you really don't want to mess with it. So yeah, if you set it low, you'll get like lower CPU temperature readings, but that's because you're messing with the temperature sensor, not because the CPU is using less power. Okay, so don't touch that one either. It's there for cold bug removal. Then we have VCCST. This is for, well, I think it stands for standby voltage. Gigabyte calls it, yeah, Gigabyte I think also calls it standby voltage, and Asus I think calls it substained or something like that, or I might have those swapped around. Either way, this voltage on LN2 will sometimes change. Like, you'll sometimes get on some CPUs when you're on liquid nitrogen, you'll get issues with like applying CPU ratios where you raise the ratio and the chip just randomly locks up when you press apply, even if the ratio is not all that high. So fine-tuning that voltage can help with that. It doesn't actually, this one's not just to raise it for more better. This one actually has a sweet spot, and you basically need to find that sweet spot, and to some extent it's going to be quite chip-specific. So yeah, anyway, and then we have a boot voltage for that one. Same story as like VBoot for all the other ones. You might need it higher or lower to get the chip to just start. Then we have Core Pll voltage. But this is another one of those voltages that, again, like you only need it on LN2. Messing with it at ambient doesn't achieve anything. I've tried. Then we have internal ring Pll voltage. This one is the same situation. Great for LN2 overclocking, completely bloody useless at ambient. System agent Pll voltage. Changing this voltage at ambient makes everything worse, not better, so don't mess with it. Memory controller Pll doesn't do anything. I've tried messing with that one. This one makes things, like raising this one straight up makes things worse. Raising that one doesn't achieve anything. So, you know, both of these, just kind of ignore them. I have heard that apparently on some engineering sample CPUs they can help, but on most retail chips they shouldn't do anything. And my chip's an engineering sample chip, and mine doesn't care at all. Like, you can tweak them up and down, and, well, this one just makes things worse. That one doesn't do anything. Pch voltage, this might help if you're, like, trying to crank, like, raising this a bit might help if you're trying to crank the BCLK. But generally, it shouldn't really matter that much because the BCL, like the way BCLK is handled on the LGA 1151 socket is it's actually separated from your PCIe and SATA and all of that. So you should be able to run really high BCLK without actually having to touch the Pch voltage whatsoever. So I wouldn't, and if you're dailying, again, is like, why would you bother with BCLK overclocking? I guess if there's some weird memory, well, no, for daily, it's bloody useless. For benching, you know, use at your own risk, but it probably won't help you whatsoever. That's at least my experience. You can go very high on BCLK without actually having to touch that voltage at all. Anyway, next we get USB PCIe Pll, and I don't think this one's even useful for LN2 overclocking. We're just going to load up one of Lumi's profiles. Yeah, he likes to raise the PCH voltage. I personally never bother with that. I normally just set it back to auto, but yeah, so this one, like, doesn't do anything. Dmi Link, so this is a issue where the connection between the CPU and the chipset, that actually freezes out, which is why that's cranked up all the way to 1.8 volts. So that's actually, that's for LN, that's again basically just for LN2 overclocking. If you're dailying, you don't have to worry about that at all. So yeah, that's kind of the voltages in this tab. And now we're going to go back to restore defaults. Yay! How much time have we? 30 minutes. Great. Okay, now we're in the memory tab. We have memory profiles of manual, XMP, you know, and XMP2, and the difference between the two is that XMP2 doesn't bloody work. Some memory sticks actually have two different XMP profiles. My stick only has one profile, so that's why it looks like it doesn't work. Anyway, what's worth noting with the Z390 Dark is in a lot of cases, if you just set auto, it'll run really, like the auto timings from this board are actually pretty tight. And probably tighter than anything your XMP profile sets, because XMP profiles are generally optimized for stability more so than raw performance. So, you know, if you're lazy, you can just try set everything to auto, and well, afterwards you're gonna want to run a memory stability test, but you know, the board will tend towards pretty aggressive memory timings on its own. So we've got all our primaries. One thing worth noting about command rate on this motherboard is that if you're running 4000 megahertz CL12, the motherboard uses a completely different memory training procedure during startup, which makes 1T possible at 4000 CL12, but it's not going to work if you're at 4000 CL13. Okay, because that memory training procedure only kicks in if you're at 4000 CL12, which in my opinion is kind of annoying, but at the same time I understand that EVGA just does, like, the thing is, getting 1T to work across the entire frequency range with all of the timings is essentially a case of, you know, well, you need a custom training procedure to get it to work at 4000 CL12. You need to tweak that procedure for almost every like, you need to tweak that procedure for all the other configurations, I think. Otherwise, I'd assume they just have it active all the time. And the issue is, EVGA, you know, they're not exactly the world's largest motherboard manufacturer, so doing that kind of testing is not exactly within their capability. So, you know, you will find that if you're on like an Asus motherboard, like say the Gene, you can actually run 1T command rate at high frequencies. It just makes the board a post forever because Asus has a custom training procedure as well. With the Dark, you can't run 1T unless you're at 4000 CL12, and I'm not sure where normally 1T stops. It should be around 3900 where the Intel Auto rules break down, and then past that you need custom rules, but I've not actually gotten around to testing that on this motherboard yet. But yeah, so if you want to hit high frequency at like normal timings on this board, you're going to be stuck with 2-tick command rate. It's just one of the sort of minor quirks on this motherboard. It doesn't have that much impact on your performance, especially if you consider that on this board, you'd have to sacrifice like upwards of 300 megahertz to go back down to 1T, at which point it's just better to take the extra frequency and run with it. So anyway, next we get our secondary timings, which we have all here. Then we get our tertiaries, and also, now normally you'd consider like this the end of the tertiaries, but Also, if anybody's wondering well, so these are like back-to-back timings, and these are actually well explained in the side right here. And then we get a whole bunch of settings that I don't know what they do, because they're not even explained. I assume this is like... I'm assuming that this is signal compensation, data, command, control, clock, but I'm not sure what increments those work in. I'm not sure what to do with them. So it's like I have a rough idea of what they might be, but because they're like I'm pretty sure 1 to 200 doesn't even correspond to any real values. So yeah, I'm not sure what exactly those do, and I would leave them on auto. So that, at least that's what I've been doing with them so far. Then we have these, which are just more memory timings that I'm not sure what they do. And more of that again. Then we get these two right here, which I'm not sure what they do either. Because again, it's like RDODT, that sounds like read on die termination, but I'm not sure that's not on the DIMMs, because the DIMM termination is a setting that's missing from this BIOS, which is kind of unfortunate. So yeah, and then we have DS, and that could be data skew, maybe? Like, these are so heavily abbreviated, I can't even recognize them, and I don't know what units they're in, which is rather annoying, so... yeah, I don't really know what to tell you about those, because I straight up don't know what the abbreviations stand for. Next we get Dram Spd, right, which, self-explanatory, right, tooltips tell you. And then we get RTLs and IOLs, and these are, just like, well, in some scenarios it might make sense to tweak these a bit, or at least lock them in, because the board might mistrain. But most of the time you should just leave these on auto, unless you know what you're doing with them. And quite frankly, even most of the time, I don't know what I'm doing with them. I'm just like, there's a like essentially, like the RTL stands for round trip latency, and they're tied to your frequency and your cast latency and some other timings. And essentially, there's a pattern to how they're configured, but I'm not sure what that pattern is. And it's relatively, like, you can kind of spot it when you're doing memory overclocking based on what the board defaults to. And then, you know, if you follow that pattern, you can extend that pattern past where the board kind of forgets what, like, screws it up, which is sometimes what you need to do. But most of the time, I just leave them on auto. The board's perfectly good at configuring them on its own. There's other boards out there where they'll like miss the second channel every single time. So you'll find like, for 4000 CL12, for example, you should be looking at like 49 and then 6 and 50 and 6. And I know there's some other boards where it'll go like 49, which is good, 6, which is good. And then for some reason, the next, like the channel B will be like 56 and 12. And then it's like, okay, well, then you need to fix it and put it back down to 50 and 6. Or I've had one motherboard where I had to run like 50, manually set it to 56, 51, 6, because it would do 49, 6 on the first channel, and then it would do something ridiculous on channel B, and 49, 6, 56 would not work. And so on that board, I'd had to run like, it might have actually even been 49, 6, 50, 51, 6. So yeah, basically these are a mess, and we should just ignore that I ever mentioned that they exist. If you're dailying, you don't need to worry about them. If you're doing extreme overclocking, then, I mean, I'm not going to be very helpful with them either. You can mess with them all day, but there's only a very few specific configurations that work. And generally, the motherboard's better at finding those than you're going to be. Next, we get the Advanced tab. CPU configuration, we have Enhanced Intel Speed Step. We can enable, disable that. We have Turbo Boost. Okay, so you're probably not going to want to disable that, because I assume that disables our turbo. And this motherboard, like, if you disable turbo, yeah, it should, yeah, it disables CPU overclocking. So you do not want to disable turbo. So you're going to want to leave that enabled. You have CPU C states. You can enable those, disable those, you know, whatever. So, yeah. we're just going to leave that on auto. Then we have hyperthreading, which you can enable, disable. Virtualization technology, enable, disable. More virtualization stuff, enable, disable. Active processor cores, you can downcore your CPU. There's a bunch of benchmarks that don't use, you know, that aren't multi-core or don't need that many cores, and reducing the number of cores your CPU is running is a great way to get more frequency. Then we have software guard extensions. You can enable those and disable those as well, or have them software controlled. Then we have some CPU information, so it just tells us a bunch of stuff about the CPU. Anyway, then we go back, and we have graphics configuration, which you know, integrated GPU, PCIe GPU, or auto, the board auto. There we go. And you can also opt to disable the iGPU completely, or you can leave it enabled. If you want to use it for, like, what is it? There's some encode, like there's some iGPU accelerated stuff available in some software. So if you want to have iGPU acceleration available, you're going to want to have that enabled, because I think the board automatically disables the iGPU if you have a dedicated GPU. Anyway, next we get PCIe configuration. We can change our link speed, right, for all of our different PCIe slots. Next we have PCH configuration, where you can't do anything, so I don't know why it's called configuration when it should just be like PCH info or something. Then we have power management, you know, what to do after AC power loss, after you restore an AC power loss, sleep state options, that efficiency standard thing, and you have dark mode, which disables all the LEDs on the board. Now, considering that this board doesn't have any god-awful RGB and it's mostly just diagnostics LEDs, I would keep the LEDs on, because if there's a problem, the LEDs will tell you about it, which RGB doesn't do. It just, you know, hurts your eyes. Anyways, next we got some onboard devices configuration. You can turn your LAN on and off. You can enable wake on LAN, which I've never actually used, so, but it is available. There is dual NICs on this card, so you can actually disable, you know, that chip and also that one. You can disable your audio. You can disable your extra SATA ports. You can disable your extra USB ports, which the AS Media SATA and the USB ports are primarily there for legacy operating system support, so like Windows 7 as well as Windows XP. We're going to put those back to enabled. And then, oh yeah, you can choose between, you can mess around with some of the M.2 capabilities. So yeah, there's a board has, yeah, so there's a U.2 connector, and that's, you know, you can choose between that being configured at U.2 or one of the M.2 slots. Then you have one M.2 slot that I guess is independent of everything else. And then there's a PCIe slot on this motherboard that shares all of its lanes with one of the M.2 slots, so you can choose if that's on the PCIe slot or on the M.2 slot. I think by default it goes to the M.2 slot, but no, because we just cleared the BIOS, so it is on PCIe. So yeah, this way it's the PCIe slots enabled, that way it's the M.2 slot that's enabled. So anyway, that's what we have there. Then we have some USB configuration settings. You can just disable all your USB ports if you feel like it, I assume. Yeah, that's basically all you can do. Oh yeah, and like disable BIOS update over USB and that kind of thing. And there's legacy USB support. So that's that. Then we have SATA configuration. You can choose between HCI, AHCI, and RAID mode. You can enable, disable hot plug for all of your different SATA ports. That's all that. Then we have hardware monitoring. Here you can choose the debug port configuration. So you have the 4-digit postcode on this motherboard. You can change which way the digits are displayed, depending on how your motherboard is oriented, you know, on your, because this board is meant for like test bench use. So depending on where you're standing relative to the board, it might be more convenient to have it one way or another. Personally, I don't care, so I've never changed it. The 4-digit postcode is a 4-digit postcode because it gives you options to monitor all of the things. So yeah, you can have, normally like during startup, it'll show you the post procedure, but after it's started up, you can monitor CPU temperature, VRM temperature, system temperature. What's that? I guess PCH, CPU, vCore, memory voltage, VCCIO. I wonder what that one's hooked into. VCCIO, VCCSA, standby voltage, Pll voltage, other Pll voltage, VTT. Oh, that's DDR VTT. And as well as you can just disable the port if you don't want to have any useful information being indicated. I normally just have it on CPU temperature. Next we get CPU fan speed settings. So these are kind of awkward to control because you can't just hit enter on them. So yeah. Actually, you can just punch in values as well. Oh, there is a max option. So, why? Okay, so if I press the plus button, it doesn't let me go into max. Okay, cool. That's the same for, I think, all of them? Wait, no, there's smart fan settings. So, there. And unfortunately, this doesn't have, like, a visual indication of the fan curve, does it? So, yeah, and you can choose between CPU temperature, VRM temperature, PCH temperature? Something temperature. Anyway... So that's the settings for that, and that's how that works for basically every single one of the fans. And then you can choose between PWM mode and DC mode. So if you have a 4-pin fan, then you want to use PWM mode. If you have a 3-pin fan, you want to use DC mode, but the board should auto-detect that. The only time you should be messing with this for manual configuration is if the board misdetects like a PWM fan as a DC fan or a DC fan as a PWM fan, which it really shouldn't do. So... yeah, but if it does, you can manually force it into whichever configuration, whichever fan type you want. And then at the bottom here, we have some voltage readouts, which I'm not sure how accurate they are. But those do look like they're in spec, so they're probably fine. I've seen some motherboards like have voltage readouts that are just like the reading is so wrong that if it was actually real, the motherboard shouldn't be working anymore. So, and then you check the reading and it's like, it is actually completely wrong. So yeah, but here, those are all working. I do not believe that my room is at 16 degrees. So that temperature sensor might be miscalibrated a bit. But that's memory VRM temperature. Yeah, that's not at 16. I just put my finger up against the choke. So I guess that's why the temperature finally came up a bit. But, yeah, so you have temperatures up at the top as well. So next we get trusted computing, which is a section of the BIOS I don't know anything about because I never mess with this kind of stuff, but you can enable and disable it. There's also this stuff and that and this and also that and all of this and whatever that is and this, which luckily doesn't open up any more submenus, so I don't have to go further. Then we have some NVMe stuff, which I don't have any NVMe drives because I think they're really overpriced, and so we can't do anything with it. Like, there's nothing there either. Next, we have the boot settings. So you can disable the speaker beep. I kind of like it because it tells you when, like, you don't have to pay so much attention to the board booting up because it'll beep at you. And then you can quickly turn around and mash the delete key to get in the BIOS. You have Fastboot, which you can enable and disable. And enables disable. I wonder if that has impact on the memory training procedure, because I'd assume if you have this on, it'll probably just skip the memory training procedure on after like the memory's been trained once, it'll skip it, whereas this way it should be retraining every single time. If you're doing you might basically if you're doing benching, then you might want to turn that on and off depending on what you're doing. If you're dailying, you'll probably want that on just so that your system doesn't take forever to post. Doesn't take as long to post as it normally would. Skip home page when, so this is like if you want to minimize your boot time, you can also skip the BIOS splash screen. I, of course, never turn that on because I actually want to get into the BIOS more often than I want to get into Windows. So then we have Windows 7 installation support, which you can enable, disable. Boot mode, you can go between UEFI and Legacy. right? So it's that. Then we have some boot option selections, CSM, so compatibility support module, which, yeah, I currently have that set to legacy because I have a bunch of GPUs that, well, if you mod the BIOS on AMD GPUs, it screws up their UEFI support, so then this doesn't work. So that's why normally I have that on legacy, which actually I think this changes based on BIOS version, if it's on legacy by default or not, because I know on other BIOSes I have issues with that having to configure that manually, but you can also just completely disable that, of course, and you have those options for network and for storage. So that's that. And we have some security settings. You can set a BIOS password, whatever this is. Can enable, disable that, right? No. So, yeah, I've never messed with this. I don't know what any of this does. But, yeah. So, yeah. But this all exists if you're interested in whatever the secure boot stuff does. And then we have some priorities for priority options, which seem to be handled like rather inconveniently, but anyway. Oh yeah, that's for USB and hard drive. Okay, so they just have them as separate menus. I didn't notice. So that's that. Then we have save and exit, where we have just save changes and reset, discard changes, restore defaults, load last saved settings. Then we have boot override, so you can force the motherboard to boot into, like, you can go from the BIOS to boot into the into an operating system or a USB stick or whatever. And you can also save profiles, and you can save a lot of profiles. Man, this is actually a really smooth scrolling animation compared to some motherboards. And you can also load all of those profiles. You can also save profiles to USB sticks, and you can load profiles from USB sticks. So, yeah, and if you just want to save a profile, you hit enter, type in whatever, and bam. And if you press F8, you can load profiles, and if you press F7, you can save profiles. And I think F1, yeah, F1 brings up the help as usual, so get all of that there, right there. So I think that covers everything for the BIOS on the EVGA Z390 Dark. So, yeah, that's the BIOS on this board. Hopefully this was somewhat helpful. Unfortunately, you know, it's like the only parts of the BIOS I really care about are the overclocking menus. And unfortunately, because I don't really have, you know, well, I have way too much hardware and nowhere near enough liquid nitrogen for all of it, so I don't actually spend that much time with any one CPU on LN2 to really figure out all of the voltages that much, which is why I find, you know, the profiles like this super helpful. Yeah, and also with the memory settings, like, the issue is that the memory settings often, like, once you go outside of, like, the tertiary timings, it's basically, like, some boards have these, some boards don't, the names aren't consistent, and so it makes it really hard to kind of just, to explain all of those. And then we have a bunch of settings which I just don't use because I don't need them. So, yeah, which is, but hopefully, you know, you saw all the options you wanted to see in the BIOS on this board. And this was somewhat helpful, so thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions. Oh, wait, I forgot to talk about the droop settings, didn't I? I mean, I talked about them a bit during when going over Lumi's LN2 profile, but for day-to-day usage, you're going to want to run minus 25% or minus 50%, because quite frankly, disabled is not going to do anything for your stability, and it's just going to make the CPU really freaking hot. Same goes for minus 75%. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I've mostly been using minus 25%. So yeah, anyway, yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon and also Teespring merch. You can find links to both down in the description below. They help out immensely with things like, say, the budget for buying more LN2. And I totally don't waste that budget on random ancient GPUs that nobody cares about. Nope, definitely don't do that. Anyway, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.